Thank you, Lord. We started last week in Revelation chapter 8. And the first verse there we covered as the seventh seal. And if you missed that, I want to just tell you, you can look at last week's. It talks about silence in heaven. That is the seventh seal. And so in verse 2, we're going to start. And in this portion of the chapter, we're going to hear about the trumpets of God. There are 7 seals, and there's 7 trumpets, and there's 7 vials. So in chapter 8, we're going to see the blowing of the trumpets here. In the second verse, as we begin, it says, "And I saw the 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets." And verse 3, it says here, "Another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne." I'll read you verse 4 also here. It says, "And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand." We had covered this in Revelation 5 about the incense and the prayers going together. I'm looking back into Revelation 5 and verse 8, where it says that when he had taken the book, the 4 beasts and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of saints. Now, my Bible has a footnote that says that odors, O-D-O-U-R-S, should be interpreted incense, connecting incense and prayer together. We talked about that. I was reminded as I was thinking on these things, do you remember Zacharias in Luke chapter 1? This would be John the Baptist's father, that he was a priest. I'm going to read to you out of Luke chapter 1. This is in the gospel. Verse 5 says, "There was in the days of Herod the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias." You see that? Zacharias was a priest. And as I read you verses 8 and 10, there in Luke 1, it says, "And it came to pass that while he executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course," verse 9 says, "according to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord." And verse 10 says, "And the whole multitude of the people were praying without at the time of incense." Do you see that? The incense went with the prayers of the people. Yeah. And I want you to realize that when you're praying, you have your alone time with the Lord. It's going up before God as a sweet smelling savor, like an aroma that's just very pleasant. There are things that smell good, right? It is just in your mind, think about that. I'm going to read to you out of the Psalms 141, and I'll read you there in verse 2. It says, "Let my prayer be set before thee as incense, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice." So you see in there prayers and incense. Let my prayer come up before you as incense, that sweet you know what? We really want the Lord to hear our prayers and respond to them. And that incense is like a good, a pleasing, something that is pleasing to Him. And the lifting up of your hands, you know, when I was a little kid, I was taught to pray like with your hands folded, like in a prayerful, this, right? But when I read this lifting up of my hands, I was thinking, you know, it's really more like, and I'm not saying praying with folded hands is wrong, but in my mind, I think it should be more of like a little child. You know those little toddlers, when they want you to hold them, they lift up their hands to you. They are, and I'm going to put this, yes, just like this.
Yeah, right.
That's what they do.
Right, Lord.
And that's why anymore, when you find me praying, I'm going to have my hands lifted, because that to me is more in tune with, and I see I've got my hands folded here right now because I'm holding this microphone, but I'm not offended by hands like this. I just think that there's a greater sense of reaching out to God when you are lifting up your hands. That's what I see in Psalms 141 and verse 2. And so, now the trumpets haven't started yet, okay? I would just want you to know they're preparing for it. This is another throne room scene. We've seen multiple throne room visions. You're seeing this actually taking place there in the throne room, because that's where you would find the golden censer and where the incense is. See, like in verse 3, it says, the golden altar which was before the throne. That tells me we are still looking at another throne room vision there. And so as I go on here in verse 5, it says, and the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. Now, mine has another footnote on that into, and it says here that should have been interpreted upon the earth. Not into the earth, but upon the earth. And as I'm looking at there, I'm looking down here at verse 7. When the first angel sounded, it says, there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. Do you see that? Now that's a first trumpet, but I just see that when, in verse 5, the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar, he cast it upon the earth. Do you see that? There's fire that was taken from the altar and then thrown upon the earth. And that is as we read in verse 7, but we haven't got there yet, because I want to finish verse 5 there. It says, and there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. This is something that we have talked about before because it's happened multiple times. Now I want you to know that sometimes we think, well, it happened here and here and here, and they're all different things, right? And yet we've talked about how things are happening simultaneously, meaning at the same time. Time-wise, things are said and resaid, and they're the same things happening. They just might be said in a different way. And so, and the voices, thunderings, and lightnings, I see it in Revelation 4. Revelation 4 and verse 5, it says, and out of the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices. And then when I turn and I look again, I see it. I just read it to you out of chapter 8. But I'm looking across the page at Revelation 10. And here, I'll read you verses 1 through 4. It says, I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. He had in his hand a little book open, and he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot upon the earth, and cried with a loud voice as when a lion roars. Now, we talked about this, but I want to go on down there farther. It says, when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And verse 4, when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write, and I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. So we see that there are thunders there, and we know that that's the voice of God. When we were covering Revelation 5, no man could open the book except the Lion of the tribe of Judah, right? That's Jesus. Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And when we got to chapter 6, it says, and when I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals. See, Jesus is the Lamb. We saw that in Revelation 5 and 6, that he was the Lamb slain. And so, and often you'll see it again, that he is portrayed as the Lamb. I see in Revelation 11 and verse 19. It says, and the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. Okay, but that's not the end. That was Revelation 11:19. I look at chapter 16 and verse 18. It says, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. Earthquake. When the Lord comes, when we're talking about the earthquake a few weeks ago, I brought out in Zechariah 14. That's the last chapter in the book of Zechariah. And it talks about Jesus coming, that he will come to the Mount of Olives. Remember in Acts chapter 1, they watched Jesus go up, and the clouds received him out of their sight, and 2 men in white apparel appeared to him and said, why do you stand gazing up in the sky? He said, Jesus is coming back in like manner. That was at the Mount of Olives. Zechariah 14 tells us that he is coming back on the Mount of Olives. That will be his landing place. We also said last week when we were talking about silence in heaven, when Jesus comes, every eye will behold him. That's Revelation 1, chapter 1 and verse 7. Every eye is going to see him when he comes. Okay, I'm looking back here in Revelation chapter 8 here, and it goes on there in verse 6. It says, the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. They hadn't sounded yet, but in the next verse we're going to see that the first one sounds his trumpet, okay? We saw that in verse 2 that they were given 7 trumpets, and in the 6th verse it says the seven angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. It says here in verse 7, it says, the first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of the trees were burnt up, and all the green grass was burnt up. So you see 1/3 of the trees burnt up, and it says all the green grass. Do you see that? I don't have any special meaning to that. I do sometimes think that trees, are we talking literally? I tend to want to think about literal and symbolic, right? I do look for fire to come down, hail, because we've seen it multiple times that hail is a form of judgment, right? One of the 10 plagues that, you know, when they came, Moses led the children out of Egypt, that there were 10 plagues that was executed upon the Egyptians, right? One of them was hail. And in fact, as you in your memory, and if you want to go back and look at that in the book of Exodus, you can find the Passover is there about Exodus 12. So if you go back from there, you'll see, I have them marked in here, but I didn't really want to go through that. But I do see that hail was one of them. There was multiple, like frogs in the bed, frogs in the oven, frogs in their kneading boards. They were everywhere, right? There was flies, there was a grievous murrain. You know that the last plague was the killing of the firstborn. That's where we see Passover. He said, I want you to keep this as an ordinance and celebrate it. So you remember, it's like you celebrate a certain holiday, a holy day. Passover is one of those important ones to remember. So, but I'm mentioning that because hail is a form of judgment. And as I look over in the book of Job, I'm going to Job 38. And I see here in verses 22, this is Job 38, and this is towards the end of the book of Job. I think there's like 42 verses in the book of Job. It says, hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of hail? That's H-A-I-L. I want you to understand we're talking about H-A-I-L. That's those things that when you have a really bad storm, it's like ice. Job chapter 38, verses 22, and I'll read you 23. And this, you picture things in your mind that God has a storehouse in heaven that is full of snow or hail, but that's what this says. He says, hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which, in verse 23, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war. Do you see that? It's coming. It's coming. When I look at Revelation 16, when it talks about that great earthquake, it talks in that chapter about hail being the weight of a talent. Do you know that that's really heavy? I remember some time ago, Sister Ada, I think you must have Googled it and asked how much a talent weighs, and I was really surprised how heavy that is. I could look in the dictionary, but I'm not going to. Take my word for it.
Yeah,
If you got
it's big.
hit by a hailstone, the weight of a talent, it would kill you. It would kill you. In fact, when the hail was falling in Egypt before the Passover, those people that were caught out in the field, they didn't make it. And they didn't bring their animals in, the animals didn't make it either. Okay, now that was the first trumpet, is that you got fire and you've got hail, right? Okay, and then you get a third part of the trees which were burnt up, and the green grass was burnt up. And then it says, verse 8, this is the second angel. And the second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. I'm going to read verse 9 because I believe it goes with this great mountain burning. It says, and the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. When I say burning mountain, what do you think of? I'm just volcano. Okay. If this was in a literal sense, you would look for a volcano, right? Does anybody remember when Mount St. Helens? Now, it's probably before Marcus's time, because I think it was 1980. Wasn't it about 1980? So if you were born after that time, you wouldn't remember it. But it was pretty devastating, and there were some people that were killed because they were either on the mountain or in one of those campgrounds, because it's kind of like in a park setting. And you know, there are multiple volcanoes in a lot of different places.
Islands are mostly just volcanoes.
The big island of Hawaii, I think there's 3. Kilauea, Mauna Loa, Mauna Kea. So, and that's how they're formed, is by volcanoes. And of course, you know, there's the Ring of Fire, which is a lot of volcanic. So you could, if you were looking at this literally, you would be looking for a volcano. But to have a third part of the sea become blood, and a third part of the creatures which were in the sea died, and a third part of the ships were destroyed, that would be, you know, I know that when Mount St. Helens went off, there was like a smoke cloud that might have come to Oklahoma. I don't know whether you noticed it, or that you had ash on your cars when it went off, because the wind has a way of just picking things up and moving it through the air, right?
They had videos of that. When it blew the top of that thing off, it just, all those big trees, big pines and things were just blown flat.
Yeah.
Just all knocked over all at once, just poof.
I've noticed that in, I think when they were showing pictures of Chernobyl. We haven't got to that part yet, but when there's a huge explosion and there's a forest nearby, trees are just are pushed over like pencil sticks.
Yeah.
You know, like I don't know if they do pickup sticks anymore, but that was a game from back in the 50s where you know, picking up sticks. Those trees look like just little sticks. That's visually on the mountain. Okay, I for a long time have thought of this in a symbolic way and thought that this is a kingdom that is literally destroyed blown off the mountain. And the reason why I think of it as a kingdom, because I can look here at the judgment, when it talks about the kingdom of the beast. I'm going to Revelation 17. Now, you know when it's describing the beast, and when it is talking about the beast in 17, it's really talking about what in my language, I call him the Antichrist. 2 Thessalonians 2 calls him a man of sin or son of perdition, right? But just in my own head, I have him called the Antichrist, because I know that he's going to set up a kingdom. Revelation 13, we're not there yet, but I can see that it's going to be like a one world order. You hear that language a lot in politics, one world, where they have a one religion. We have one financial system where you can't buy or sell without the mark of the beast. Well, that's the beast that we're talking about here. And so as I'm looking here in Revelation 17, it says here, and verse 17:7 says, "And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns." Okay, this tells me that the beast is carrying this woman, which in verse 5 calls Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. That's the woman that we're talking about. You can call her Babylon, because I'm going to get to that here in just a second. But this beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. And when I look down in verse 9, it says, "And here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." And then it goes on, verse 12, it says, "The 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast." So we look to this as kingdoms. Mountains are kingdoms, okay?